Would you choose to live in a world with no war, no violence, no needless deaths? What if there was a politician who could make all of that true? I'd vote for them in a heartbeat. Wouldn't you? But what if in order to get there, we had to drop a nuclear bomb and kill tens of thousands of innocent people? Would you still vote for them? What if it was millions of people? This is all a hypothetical. But it's also not far from real-life scenarios, like Harry S. Truman's choice to drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, arguably ending World War II, or Henry Kissinger's position that a limited nuclear war could prevent total world annihilation. All this has me wondering, how much evil could I tolerate in a politician if I knew it would lead to some greater good? And is it possible that good leaders have to be willing to do bad things? I'm Ellie Anderson, and this is Crash Course Political Theory. This line of questioning led me straight to the 16th century political thinker, Niccolò Machiavelli, who, in response to the question, is it better for a leader to be feared or loved, wrote this banger. It might perhaps be answered that we should wish to be both, but since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved. He's got bars. He wrote those words in a book called The Prince, a political treatise so provocative the Catholic Church banned it for 200 years. And so spicy in its hot takes, we debate who Machiavelli really was to this day. Was he a teacher of evil, a satirical genius, or just the world's first political scientist? When I started to dig in, I learned that he was many things. A historian, diplomat, politician, and occasional enemy of the state who lived in interesting times. He once conspired to steal a river with Leonardo da Vinci and a tyrant named Cesare Borgia. Big Ocean's 11 energy. And just a year before he wrote The Prince, Machiavelli lost his job and nearly his life. The Medici family violently overthrew the administration he was working for, chucked him in prison, and tortured him for weeks by hoisting him into the air by his wrists, tied behind his back. Ouch. So yeah, Machiavelli was up close and personal with the brutal underbelly of politics. And yet, if I'm being honest, I find a lot of The Prince to be surprisingly boring. Unless you're really into the taxonomy of principalities, you do you. But the juicy parts are quite juicy. It's time for some important documents. There's advice on how to rout out old enemies and make new ones. Advice on spending others' wealth to boost your own reputation. Advice on how to make threats, how to be mean without being hated, and how to spark fear that inspires loyalty. Regina George, take notes. There's praise for the usefulness of lying and the thriftiness of colonizing, which Machiavelli claims costs little and offends only the people whose lands are taken. And for a person hoping to seize power, Machiavelli has this sage advice. Examine closely into all those injuries which it is necessary to inflict, and then do them all at one stroke, so as not to have to repeat them daily. So it makes sense that we often hear Machiavellian used to describe politics gone nasty. The sort of conniving, unscrupulous, bad-to-the-bone wheeling and dealing I love in my HBO dramas. Or in Michael Scott quotes that live rent-free in my mind. Just keep it away from the leaders I vote for. Based on what we've read so far, you might be thinking, yeah, instincts confirmed. This Machiavelli guy sounds like a bad dude. But if you read his words closely, something else becomes obvious. He isn't actually calling for all-out nastiness here. He writes that a leader should know when and how to be cruel, but also when to be merciful. He cautions that there are times when wickedness is useful and times when it's not. Times when it's good to be stingy and times when it's better to be generous. So I started thinking, maybe The Prince isn't the handbook on iron-fisted rule it's been made out to be. Turns out, a lot of it is focused on something resembling, and stay with me here, balance. He's arguing that effective politicking really means knowing when to be good and when to be not good. None of this would be necessary, Machiavelli writes, if men were entirely good. But because they are bad and will not keep faith with you, you too are not bound to observe it with them. In other words, play dirty. The other side does. It's a pretty pessimistic take, right? At this point, I'm thinking, where are the higher, loftier ideals like justice, virtue, and liberty? But then I remembered that in Machiavelli's time, Florence's republic was more fragile than my 15-year-old self watching The Notebook for the first time. Most citizens had no real say in who governed them, and power plays between rival families threatened the republic's future. So some interpret the prince as a defense of republicanism, not the partisan position we're familiar with today, but the broader shift to democratic popular rule that was tenuously underway at the time after centuries of monarchy. And when I think about it that way, I wonder if Machiavellian really just means strategic. What if it's a pragmatic take on how politics really gets done, where the main goal is bare minimum, keep the state together? What some might call a real downer. Others simply call political realism, the view that keeping the state afloat is more important than sticking to moral absolutes. And since the end of World War II, so-called realists have thrived in international politics, including the infamous Henry Kissinger. Let's go to the tape. In 1948, at 25 years old, Henry Kissinger wrote to his parents, "There is not only right or wrong, but many shades in between." And in his long diplomatic career, Kissinger dabbled in all of them. As Secretary of State under Presidents Nixon and Ford, Kissinger embraced realpolitik, a strand of realism that prioritizes what's practical for the national interests over what's ethical. Kissinger took realpolitik further than your average politician, and he ventured into very murky waters when doing so. He theorized about how to use nuclear bombs in moderation to avoid total annihilation. He backed brutal military coups in Latin America and supplied weapons used in ethnic cleansing in South Asia to keep the United States in power. He personally approved bombing raids that killed hundreds of thousands of people in the Vietnam War and tried to hide it from the press. Then, when the news leaked, he ordered the FBI to wiretap phones. But even Kissinger's critics don't deny. The man got some things done. He changed the course of the Cold War, warming the United States' relationships with the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. He negotiated international treaties on biological weapons, nuclear arms, and anti-ballistic missiles. This was how he justified making morally compromised choices, writing that insistence on pure morality is in itself the most immoral of postures. Being too high-minded, he argued, stopped things from getting done. It's up to us to debate whether any good came of Kissinger's actions, even if his actions were sometimes abhorrent. It didn't surprise me to learn that Kissinger's politics often get described as Machiavellian, as do Donald Trump's, which brings me back to the present. But really, it brings me back to the prince itself and what it means for us now. Maybe it's too simple to think of the prince as like a cookbook. Dash of cruelty, tablespoon of deceit, easy weeknight recipes for getting and keeping power. Instead, I started thinking of it as posing those same questions I wrestle with every time an election rolls around. Do politics and morality belong together or apart? Should I vote for the lying, cheating candidate as long as their opinions align with my own? In other words, what matters more? Outcomes or ideals? That question led me back in time again, all the way to 1919, when a German sociologist and political economist named Max Weber pondered the same thing. To Weber, politicians have an ethic of responsibility, where they sometimes need to make hard choices for the sake of bigger goals, like governing a country, even if those choices conflict with traditional morals. But here's where it gets really interesting. Two very different kinds of politics emerged from that singular idea. In one corner, Carl Schmitt, a German political theorist. In 1927, he argued that conflict in politics was inevitable. There would always be friends and enemies. And he thought liberal democracies were destined to weaken and crumble, either due to disagreement from within or from getting strong-armed by a more unified force. So he thought a sovereign dictator was a good idea. Somebody who could unify people against a perceived common enemy and then eliminate that enemy. Getting Nazi vibes? Good, you should be. It means your Nazi radar is working. Check it well, check it often. In the other corner, there was Hannah Arendt, a German-American philosopher who also questioned morality's place in politics after witnessing the disturbing rise of totalitarianism in Germany and Russia. In a world where everyday people had caved to social pressure and collaborated with evil, traditional morals seemed pretty irrelevant. But Arendt observed that some people had refused to go along with brutal regimes, turning to their inner judgment rather than some transcendent moral virtue. So she argued that the public sphere demands its own set of values, grounded in a respect for differences rather than moral absolutes. And Arendt actually praised Machiavelli as someone who understood that if people aren't willing to make hard choices to resist evil, then the evildoers will do as they please. To Arendt, Machiavelli wasn't a teacher of evil. He was somebody willing to sacrifice his own soul for the sake of his country. You'll recognize this idea from every superhero story ever. When is it worth compromising on your morals to defeat the evildoer? And Katherine Zuckert, an American political philosopher, similarly views Machiavelli in a positive light. She argues that The Prince was actually an effort to show ordinary people how the political sausage gets made. In her view, Machiavelli encourages people to see politicians as they are, not as demons or as saints, and to be clear-eyed and pragmatic about that, so we can shape our government to be more responsive to our needs. I'll be honest, I'm not sure hundreds of years of political theory have gotten us any closer to definitively answering this core question. How much evil should we tolerate in exchange for good outcomes? Maybe, definitely, politicians aren't saints. And maybe we do ourselves a disservice when we expect them to be. Some argue we're better off viewing politics as a negotiation between outcomes and ideals, with no simple formulas. So, do good leaders have to be good people? Or does being a good leader mean, in part, learning how not to be good? I'll leave that for you to decide. Next time, we'll talk about the so-called specter of communism. See you then. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course Political Theory, which was filmed at the Bastille Studio and was made with the help of all these nice people. If you want to help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever, you can join our community on Patreon.